So this is the third part of our study on the Bible's case for Christianity. In the last part, we began to build the biblical case for Christianity by exploring the case for God's existence. And we pointed out in closing that if God exists, then miracles are necessarily possible. And it is to the reality and significance of these special acts of God that we now shift our attention. So, as is the case with the existence of God, the Bible does not provide a detailed defense of the reality of miracles, other than the fact that it records them as having happened. In fact, the reality of miracles is simply taken as a given in light of the fact that God exists. And this is perfectly reasonable when we take a moment to think about it. As we discussed in the last part of our study on the question of God's existence, one of the reasons we know instinctively that God exists is that the entire creation testifies to its creator. And this, of course, means that God had already performed the greatest miracle of all, the creation of everything from nothing. We're told this in the very first verse of the Bible, Genesis 1 verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, though the Bible takes it as a given that miracles happen, it does not assert this in broad terms without giving us any evidence. In fact, the Bible is full of references to numerous miracles besides the original creation event, which took place throughout human history and were observed and recorded by many eyewitnesses. And these historical eyewitness records of the miraculous are indeed found throughout both the Old and New Testaments. Moses, for example, reminds the Israelites in Deuteronomy 10, verse 21, of all the miracles God had performed in their presence, from the miraculous acts of judgment on Egypt to the miraculous means of rescue and provision in the wilderness. He writes, "He is your God, who has done for you these great and terrifying things that your eyes have seen." The people of Israel witnessed these acts of God with their own eyes. Fast forward to the New Testament, and we find that the Apostle John indicates that Jesus' miracles were performed in the presence of the disciples. In John 20, verse 30, he writes, "Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book." But it wasn't just the disciples who witnessed these things. The Apostle Peter, in addressing the people of Israel in his Pentecost sermon, indicates that they too were witnesses to Christ's miracles, and adds that the disciples in particular were witnesses to the resurrection of Christ. He said, "Men of Israel, hear these words. Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. This Jesus God raised up, and of that we are all witnesses." Now, whether or not these reports of miracles in the New Testament are reliable is going to be the subject of the next part of this study. But for now, the main points are that miracles are at least possible by virtue of God's existence, that at least some miracles have taken place, including the creation of the universe, and that if God could create the universe, then he could certainly have performed other comparatively lesser miracles as are recorded in the Bible. And this means that all these reported miracles are at least within the realm of possibility. But what would be the significance of such supernatural events? What would be the purpose of God performing miracles? Well, in truth, miracles serve a number of purposes in Scripture, and these purposes quite often overlap. As sometimes miracles were acts of judgment, as was the case with the plagues in Egypt and the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Other times, miracles were acts of grace and mercy, such as when Jesus would heal the sick. But in general, the primary purpose of miracles in biblical thought is that of vindication or authentication or confirmation. That is, miracles can be used by God to confirm a messenger and his message as being from God. After all, if someone were to come to you claiming that they were sent from God with a message from God that is therefore authoritative over you, what better evidence could you ask of that person for these claims than for God to act through them in a special way that only God can? That is, perform a miracle. And this is exactly what we see happening throughout the biblical record. Time and time again, we see miracles being performed by God to confirm a messenger and his message as being from God. Now let's look at a few key examples to highlight this principle. My favorite Old Testament example is found in 1 Kings 18, verses 20 to 40, though we need only look at verses 22 to 24 to see the principle here. So in these verses, Elijah issues a challenge to the prophets of the pagan god Baal in order to prove once and for all the identities of the one true God, whether it's Baal or Yahweh, the God of Israel, and the true prophet or prophets of God, whether it's Elijah or the prophets of Baal. So here's the challenge issued in verses 22 to 24. Then Elijah said to the people, I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord. So that's the first statement. He alone is the prophet of God. But Baal's prophets are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I'll call upon the name of the Lord. And the God who answers by fire, he is God. So it's a test to identify the true prophets of God and to identify the true God. And all the people answered, it is well spoken. The people agreed to the challenge. And, as you might expect, the prophets of Baal failed to have their deity light the fire they built, while Yahweh, the God of Israel, answers Elijah's request with a terrifying display of fire coming down from heaven. This miraculous sign confirmed Yahweh as the one true God and Elijah as his one true prophet. And this theme of miracles as signs of divine confirmation is found elsewhere in the Old Testament and continues into the New Testament as well, and is especially predominant in the Gospel of John. In John 3, verse 2, for example, Nicodemus says to Jesus, Rabbi, we know that you are a teacher come from God, that you are a messenger from God. For no one can do these signs that you do unless God is with him. Now, the Gospel of John highlights a number of these miraculous signs, and in John 20, verses 30 to 31, the author indicates that this is a major purpose or theme of this gospel account. He writes, Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. And it was well known that Jesus was repeatedly and variously confirmed by miracles. As we saw earlier, Peter affirmed this point in his Pentecost sermon, saying in Acts 2, verse 22, Men of Israel, hear these words, Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him. in your midst, as you yourselves know." In other words, Jesus was attested by God as being sent from God. And in 2 Corinthians 12, verse 12, Paul indicates that Jesus' apostles were themselves confirmed with miracles as God's chosen and authoritative founders of the church. He writes, "The signs of a true apostle were performed among you with utmost patience, with signs and wonders and mighty works." Other examples could be given from both the Old and New Testaments, but these are sufficient to highlight the biblical principle that miracles function as signs to confirm a messenger and his message as being from God. But why should we accept these claims of miraculous signs which supposedly occurred in the midst of ancient Israel? More specifically, in terms of the Bible's case for Christianity, why should we accept the claims of miraculous signs associated with Jesus of Nazareth, his earliest followers, and their message? Well, we're going to seek to answer this question in the next part of our study as we discuss the Bible's case for the historical reliability of the New Testament. But until then, may God bless you as you seek to love him with all your mind.